Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. It's good to have everyone here physically in the building. Had some folks here who haven't been here in quite a while. We're definitely glad to have you guys back. We're glad to have you guys listening on the internet as well. We've got a couple people listening right now, so that's a wonderful blessing. This morning we're going to look at Matthew in chapter 25. And let's kind of paint a picture of where we're at right now. Jesus is in a conversation with his closest followers, right? Some of his final climactic moments of his life with them is happening right here in this chapter. And Jesus drops a bomb on them, especially in chapter 24. In the last chapter, right, he makes this prediction of the fall of the temple, the very focal point of their nation, the focal point of their religion, the focal point of their culture, the focal point of everything, he says, is going to be destroyed. And his disciples are confused because they're looking at this wonderful, glorious building, and it's not computing for them. It's not computing. And Jesus drops this bomb on them by telling them that it's going to be soon destroyed in this generation, right? What a shock that must have been. And so their first question is, when is this going to happen? And Jesus was very clear. He says it's in this generation that it's going to happen. And so he answers their second question that they ask about when his return is going to be. And he answers with a less than clear answer, right? He says, I don't know. He says, not only do I not know, the angels don't know, and only the Father knows, right? In verse 36, concerning that day and hour, nobody, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only knows that time. So there's not going to be signs, because if there were signs, you might know when it's going to be. He says, I don't know. But what he does give them, and he gives us, by extension, is instructions on how to live in the kingdom that he came to establish through his life and through his death and through his resurrection. That's the point here. The point is, you won't know when it's coming, but here's some instructions on how to live in the kingdom that I've come to establish through my life, my death, and my resurrection. So as followers of Christ, we believe that Jesus is King of the world. But not everyone acknowledges that. And so Jesus says that there will be a day when he will come again to bring his rule completely, to bring about the redemption of this creation, buying back what God owns, that we have set apart from himself. He's going to come and set all things right. That was chapter 24. That's where we're at. And so now, the question is, how are followers of Jesus supposed to live in the between time, right? That between time, we looked at it this morning in the class. It says, in chapter 25 and verse 19, now after a long time the master came back. That long time is now at least 2,000 years, right? Jesus begins by telling these stories that are supposed to cultivate a mindset of readiness, a mindset of being prepared, a mindset of being ready for the unknowable time of his return, right? So he actually begins in chapter 24, at the end of 24, by telling a story about a servant whose master goes away, right? And the servant decides to party and to squander everything, right? And get drunk and hang out with the drunks. And that didn't end well for the servant, right? So then we come into chapter 25, and he tells us a story about some young women who come unprepared to the wedding. And that didn't turn out well for them. And then he tells another story about a master leaving a huge investment of varying sizes with a few servants. And some made a profit, and one hid the investment and because of fear, and he only returned what was given to him. And that didn't turn out well for that one either. You see, the point with all of these stories, the thread that is consistent with all of these stories, is that Jesus wants us to cultivate a mindset that isn't weird end of the world speculation. This is not the mindset that these stories are telling us to have, but a mindset that looks at every event in our life, every person we meet, that every person and every event in our life is meaningful because His kingdom will come in its fullness one day, and His will be done one day, and there will be a shutting of the door. There will be a kicking out into the darkness. There will be a time when there's a cut off, where we will not have the opportunity to go back and make things right. So, let's jump right into the parable of the 10 virgins. I want to spend the most time this morning on actually the parable of the talents. So we're going to split up this chapter into two different sections. We're going to look at the first two parables here this morning, and then we're going to look at the final judgment next week, because it kind of just ballooned into too big of a lesson, and I didn't want to sit here for an hour and a half trying to get through the whole chapter 25. So, parable of the 10 virgins. I'm not going to read it this morning. If you want to read it, you can stop the video right now if you're listening. The folks here, we've already gone through it in class, and we've already read it at home. So I'm not going to read it. But let's think about what's going on, right? So we have a wedding procession that comes down the street. And the sequel to that, what happened after that, is the wedding feast in the bridegroom's house. That is about the extent of the knowledge that we have archaeologically of the first century weddings in Palestine, the land of Palestine. That's about all we know, to tell you the truth. And so there's a lot of speculation otherwise about what these virgins were doing, why there were virgins, why they had torches. There's all kinds of stuff, but the bottom line is we don't actually know. But we do know that this feast, this wedding feast at the bridegroom's house, was the ultimate high point of that week-long, sometimes, celebration. And so to miss that feast is to miss everything, right? And by the end of the story here of the virgins, it's going to veer off from that picture of reality in a wedding, and it's going to veer off into language of eschatological judgment or end times judgment. So there's a talk of a slamming door, and there's these pitiful calls of these girls that are outside that are excluded, right? And their cries to the bridegroom is Lord, Lord. And his response is, I do not know you, right? But that's odd. He invited them to the celebration. He has to know them, right? Of course the bridegroom knows his wedding party. He knows those people, but that's not the point. The point is, these words are supposed to key us into other teachings of Jesus where these same things were said. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 7 real quick. I want to read this. Matthew chapter 7, and starting in verse 21, I think. Yeah, verse 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. What is this parable about? Then the kingdom of heaven will be like, right? Will be compared to. Jesus is keying us into these previous teachings that he's already given to his disciples. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So, why then did these 5 foolish, or it depends on how you translate it, 5 foolish or 5 silly virgins, these silly girls, why did they miss the feast? It wasn't that they slept, right? It wasn't that 5 slept and 5 stayed awake, right? That's not what happened in the story. Because verse 5 says explicitly that they all went to sleep. And that all of them were woken up by that shout at midnight. And so the problem here goes back to the preparations they had made before going to sleep. So the point is very simple here. The point is that a life of readiness is not something that can be accomplished by a last-minute adjustment, right? A life of readiness is not something that we can grasp onto seconds before we die by saying, Lord, Lord, right? It depends on preparation. And if that preparation has been made, then the wise disciple, the wise young lady, can sleep securely, right? Because they have the knowledge that everything is ready, that they're just waiting on the call, and they're going to be ready to go. And so this story gives the sort of the impression that these girls thought that they knew when the groom was coming, but that they hadn't counted on any sort of delay in the process, right? And so the story is not the call to vigilance that happens at the end of chapter 24, right? What happens at the end of chapter 24, right? Jesus is talking about staying awake. Well, that's not exactly what happens here, right? Because the wise or the sensible girls, they didn't stay awake. They slept. All of them were equally disappointed by the delay. But they were all equally taken by surprise by the eventual shout also. The difference is that some were prepared. And so, if we look at some of the feasts, let's look real quick in Matthew chapter 8, real quick. Because we can compare the feasts, some of the other feasts in Matthew, with what's going on here. And these other feasts have shown the blessings of the kingdom, and they've compared it to that final messianic banquet that so many of the Jews were expecting. Right? Matthew chapter 8, in verses 11. Well, let's read 10. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled. What did he hear? Let's back up. Let me just read from verse 8. But the centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following. Jesus' response to a man who is full of faith. Truly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith in anyone in Israel. This is to a Roman centurion, he's saying this. And I say to you that many shall come from the east and from the west to recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out into the outer darkness. Into that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Sound familiar? Yeah. That was also in chapter 22 and 23 and 25. Weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the messianic banquet that all of the Jews, the sons of Israel, were hoping to attend. And Jesus says everybody from the east and the west is going to come, but the people who are already there haven't been faithful. Right? And so you get the same idea in chapter 22 in verses 1 through 13. It's only those who are ready to go who are going to enjoy the feast. And so this parable here in Matthew 25 has become like many of the other parables, a story of insiders and outsiders, right? The saved and the lost. And the closing of the door to these 5 young ladies here symbolizes that final division at the last judgment that we've already seen 4 or 5 times here in Matthew, especially in Matthew chapter 13. But we also saw it in chapter 21 and 22, that there is this cutoff, there's this shutting of the door in a final judgment. And there's this formula that's used. He says, I tell you truly, right? Jesus' words have these force, and the force they have is a judicial verdict. He is a judge. He is shutting the door. It's his final judgment, right? And these girls, they have this, it's a seemingly small lapse in judgment, right? But to buy oil, their lapse in judgment is that they don't buy oil, and that has come to symbolize, in the story, that has come to symbolize a false relationship. Because what was the whole point of them coming? The whole point of them coming was to bring torches to light the way, and they didn't just forget the oil, they didn't bring oil. They knew what their job was, and they didn't do it. That's the point of the story. The point of the story is they have a false relationship. They are not part of the true family of the bridegroom or of the party of the bridegroom. So Matthew chapter 12 and verse 50 says that whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, is my sister, is my mother. So you can be part of that family of God if you do the will of God, if you come prepared. All right, that is the parable of the 10 virgins. Now let's look at the parable of the talents now. And I want to get a little deeper into this story because the basic gist of the story, we're not going to read this again, but the basic gist of the story is that the landowner gives, or this wealthy individual gives different size investments to different servants and expects them to produce something from that investment, right? And when the landowner returns, he rewards or punishes based on their performance. And so the story can make many of us uncomfortable, right? And I think that's the point of the story, is that these stories are designed to make us think. These are young women who seemingly are innocent, right? But the whole point is that they haven't done their main job for the event that is happening. They haven't prepared. The same thing's going to happen in this story. This story is designed to make us uncomfortable. Not only did the servant not give the master anything back in return, but he went and hid the money instead of just putting it in the bank and earning interest. So, let me, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. These stories are designed to make us think. And I think many of us could sympathize with the man that buried that treasure. And I get it too. Maybe it's too much pressure, right? Maybe we don't perform well when an enormous amount of money is given to us. Maybe he knew he was never going to be like his overachiever fellow servants, right? And he knows this master. He knows this master is being a jerk. And our challenge is this, though. And it happens all the time when we talk about the parables of Jesus. We get bothered when Jesus doesn't tell stories the way that we think that they need to be told, right? Through the eyes of an American living in the 21st century, right? He doesn't always include a happy ending, right? Like the TV sitcoms that we watch on TV. There's not always a happy ending. He's trying to get under our skin. He's trying to bother us. And so we often sometimes miss the subtlety of what's going on and the brilliance of these stories we sometimes miss. And so I want to try an exercise here that I hope will help illuminate our perspective on the meaning of this story. Are we ready? I want to have a pop quiz. This is a pop quiz that nobody can fail. Who is telling the story? Who is telling the story? Well, it's Jesus, right? We always have to ask ourselves, what do I know about the way Jesus viewed his life, viewed himself, viewed God, viewed who he is, and his view of who people are? And then I need to make sure that we are viewing the parable that he's telling in that context, not through 21st century goggles, right? Jesus has no problem speaking out against people who abuse money or abuse authority. He has no problem speaking out against the rich or the powerful, right? He has no problem doing any of that. Does Jesus care about people who are timid and shy, like this individual possibly is? Well, yes. Jesus actually seems to fixate on those type of people, right? Those type of people in the beginning of Matthew are the type of people he's drawn to, right? He's not drawn to the wealthy and the powerful, but yet the wealthy and the powerful are portrayed in a positive light in this story. And so we have to keep this parable in context. Why is he in Jerusalem? Well, he's been announcing that he is bringing the kingdom of God. He is announcing that he is here to bring the reign of God to the whole world, starting with God's covenant people of Israel, right? And so this parable is giving during the last 3 or 4 days of his life, during the showdown with the leadership in Jerusalem, and he's criticizing them for rejecting his offer of the kingdom. And so he's convinced that the leadership of Israel, that the leadership of Jerusalem has squandered the gift that God has given them. That God has rescued them from Egypt, that he's provided for them in the wilderness. He provided for them in the wilderness even when they complained. Right? He gave them the gift of the Torah, the gift of the law, so that they could become a people who were shaped by God's generosity and justice to become the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that his descendants would become priests to all nations, that they would become a nation of priests. He gave them those gifts, and they have squandered those gifts. And God brings them to the promised land. Why? Why does he bring them to the promised land? So that they would become a new and different sort of people, right? A people who would not be complainers in the wilderness, be complainers of leaving slavery in Egypt, but that they would become this new and different people, a people who would become a blessing to all the nations, right? We read that in Genesis 12 this morning. And just as Jesus comes to his people to be their prophet, telling them that they have failed at their task, they have absolutely squandered the gifts and the opportunities that God has given to them. And so Jesus has come to be in the business of creating a new people around himself. He calls them people of the new covenant in the next chapter, right? 26, when he institutes the Lord's Supper. And 27, when he lives that out. He calls them the people of the new covenant. And he gives his teachings to these people. And he really expects his followers to do these things, to love their neighbor, right? And to pray for people who persecuted them. He really expects people to do this. He wants his followers to be what Israel was not. And so he tells stories for the last few chapters, from chapter 21 through where we're at right now in 25. He's telling these stories of God giving real responsibility to his people. Jesus, he didn't come to die just so that we would have this free ticket, right, to the good place when we die. That's not what Jesus is all about. That's not what the story of the Bible is all about. The story of the Bible is all about God calling man back to himself so that they could be a blessing to his creation, and especially be a blessing to each other, so that man could be a blessing to each other. In this case, they'd be a blessing to each other by following Jesus. And he means for us to take that responsibility seriously. And so let's look a little closer at the story of the talents now, or the bags of gold. I think I mentioned this previously, but I mentioned it in the class. The word talents is not really translated because we don't know how much talent was, but the NIV and a few other versions translate it as bags of gold. I think that's a really good non-literal translation, because it gives us some sense of a bag of gold. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money. So let's look at it a little closer. This would have been a very familiar scene, right? The master-servant relationship was probably 2/3 of the ancient Near East world. You were probably a servant of somebody in some sense if you lived during this time period. And so you have the super wealthy versus the poor. And one of the focal points of the story is that each is given amounts of gold according to their ability. And this gives us not only information about the servants, but also about the master. And so I want to paint the picture of what's going on here, because this is a story seen from two different angles. So we know that the kingdom of God is not all responsibilities that are one size. We know that there's different responsibilities. It's not a one-size-fits-all when God hands out gifts in the kingdom. And so the same results aren't expected of everyone. But something is expected from everybody. And so it shows us the tenderness. It shows us the fatherly nature of God, that he wouldn't say, in this family, we produce 5 bags of gold each. That's not at all what's going on here. God is seeing their abilities and tailoring his expectations based on them. Now, talent, I've mentioned, is a funny word. I think of one of the few English translations that actually translates the word is the NIV. And it calls it bags of gold. And unfortunately, it's also an English word that represents an ability that makes you special or unique. Maybe you can juggle. Maybe you can play the banjo. Maybe you can ride a unicycle. I don't know what it is that makes you special. But that is not what is being talked about here. This is an enormous amount of money. Money is a thing that you have to work to generate. And we often can make enough of it to put food on the table if we work a job here in town, and we can have a roof over our heads most of the time. But Jesus points out that when we're given an enormous amount of money, often the deepest part of our hearts come to the front. So money is a resource, and that resource creates opportunity. And what we do with opportunity when it's presented to us is a direct reflection of who we are. Do we save it and never spend it? If you know me, that's kind of my knee-jerk reaction. I'm not a big spender. I tend to pinch the pennies. Do we spend it all on ourselves? We call that greed or selfishness. Do we spend it all on others? And so the lesson here in this story is this. Jesus expects something out of us. And we all have something that has been given to us, whether that's relationships, whether that's people, whether that's opportunities or a career or situations. And these are all times when Jesus actually expects us to follow him. And for those, he expects us in those situations, in those interactions, to produce fruit for him in the world and to become a blessing to other people because we follow him. And the point is very simple. It's that readiness, whatever kind of form that readiness takes, is not something that can be accomplished by a last-minute modification. You know, right before I die, I'm going to say, Lord, Lord, as I'm dying, right? And then I'm going to be saved. Calling on the name of the Lord, right? That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the door is going to shut, and even though I'm pounding on the door, saying, Lord, Lord, I'm not going to be let in because I wasn't prepared. So it depends on the preparation. And if that preparation has been made, the wise disciple can sleep very securely in the knowledge that everything is ready. So the parables of Jesus, they often describe how people's behavior, right? How people's behavior is this window into their character. In the first parable here, we saw the five young women who were unprepared, and we think, well, they had a lapse in preparation. But the parable of the talents really drives this point home. If we look in verse 19 of chapter 25, it says, Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. If the bridegroom waited so long to come, why didn't they use some of that time to go and get oil? Is the question. If the master waited so long to come back to collect his bags of gold and the profits, why didn't this third servant go and do anything? And it's because they chose not to. That is the cheating into the story. This wasn't a person who had a bad day. This wasn't a person who had a bad week or even a year, right? This was a servant whose behavior over the years has become a window into what he really believes and what he values. And so then comes the settlement scene at the end of the story here in chapter 25, starting in verse 19. The settlement scene comes, and the first servant has been faithful over a little, right? 5 bags of gold. Anybody think that's a little bit? But this wasn't about the profit, was it? Because the second servant was faithful over a little also. The same exact words. An even smaller amount. And the master's reaction was the same. He was, wow, well done. Enter into my joy. Is joy about what? About the profit? Well, maybe. I wouldn't say it's about the profit, though, mostly. I'd say that the master here doesn't point out that the servant with 5 did better, right? He doesn't compare them, right? He uses the same exact words to describe the 2-talent man's actions, right? The master doesn't value one person more than the other based on the other person's performance. It's totally opposite of the business world, right? Because if I value this person's performance, I would definitely bring it up in the next meeting and say, hey, guys, why don't we look to this guy and see if we can all get up to speed and make money like this guy can. Our master has given us gifts, and he wants us to become what he knows that we are capable of being. It brings him joy when those things happen. This is a great boss, right? This is the master. In this story, we find out even lets his employees, his servants, keep the profit. This is the ideal workplace if we're working, right, for this person. So let's look this morning, let's finally look here at what the third servant does and his viewpoint on the situation. We've seen the viewpoint of the first two servants. They knew that the master had blessed them with this great blessing, so they take it out and they invest it. And they do well because the master knew their abilities and he trusted them with it. Well, he knew the abilities of the first one, or the third servant also, and trusted him, but he chose not to invest that money. The servant got only one bag of gold. And what are the first words out of his mouth when the master comes back? Master, I know you're a hard man. Let's just stop there. We haven't got very far, but let's stop. Ask yourself a question. Are we supposed to believe this guy? He's just praised these other servants for doing so well, and he's given them an enormous amount of money to be in charge of. Are we supposed to believe this guy? Do we believe this question is true? No. Everything in the parable here says otherwise. Everything in this parable shows us the generosity of this master. And so this third servant sees the success of the master and is resentful. His view of the master doesn't bear any relationship to reality of how this guy treats people. What the servant sees is a hardworking and successful person, right? And what he fails to observe is that the master wants to share that success and bring others into that great wealth as well. And that's what the the third servant doesn't see. The master, though, sees right through the third servant's words. Excuse me. He sees the wickedness and the laziness of this servant, and how the servant assumes the worst about everyone and then treats those people he assumes the worst of accordingly. And Jesus, he frames this so brilliantly, so perfectly here. He says that he says to the servant that if this was really a fear of failure, you could have just put the money in the bank where there wasn't any risk. If this was about fear of failure, you could have just put it in the bank. But that's not what happened, is it? What did he do? He went and buried it, which is a window into your heart, into the heart of that servant. And it betrays his motives, right? The servant had a distorted heart that doesn't care about the master, and he certainly doesn't care for the master's money. And this guy is trapped inside of his own head in his own view of who the master is. He's not seeing the reality that is around him. This kind of smacks of marital problems, right? When we have one party who thinks that they understand the motives of the other party, and do they hear anything else that comes out of the mouth of the other side? No, because they think they know the reason why he did that or she did that. That's what's going on here. This guy is trapped in his own head. And so the very centerpiece, the very center of the story, what the story is built around, is it's built around the two portraits of the master. Right? There's this picture that his actions develop, that we see who he is by what he does, that he's generous, that he's joyful when people grow themselves, and he offers opportunity and relationship with them. And then there's the picture that the third servant has in his mind, that the master's just a jerk and he's waiting for people to fail. And he's not going to participate in that. He's going to go bury his trap. And so, let's tie this all together. How does this apply to us? Well, if you're listening to this morning, maybe, I don't know anybody's heart. Maybe you're like that third servant. Maybe you see God as being very harsh and hard, and you see the world around you and how big of a jerk that some of Jesus' followers can be. Some Christians are really big jerks. I'm here to tell you this morning. I'm not going to lie about it. You can see the injustice of people who claim to follow Christ, and you can be rightfully disgusted. And so when truth comes your way about how good Jesus is, you don't hear it because of these terrible other people. This morning, I want to ask that you not look at the followers of Christ, but I want you, like this story, to look at the Master's actions, to look at Jesus himself and hear a different version of who he is through his actions. The true version that is actually rooted in his behavior and his sayings and his teachings and how he actually treated other people. You see, we gather here every Sunday because we believe that Jesus is this remarkable individual. We come together to hear his words and these stories about him because we want to become like him. Because he's invited us to become like him. And there's something about him that when you open yourself up to him and see who he is and what he's done for us, that it's just so incredible. The central aspect of this parable this morning is not should I be a good person, not should I be a bad person. That's not what this is about. It's this. The central part of this is a parable is this. Have I woken up to the true vision of who the master is? And do I have a true picture of the master's joy and generosity when he looks at me? And he knows what I am capable of. Not that I need you to be more like the person next to you. That's not what this is about. The master wants you to become the better version of who he knows you can be, that he made you to be. And so this morning, if you're ready, if you're willing, if you're wanting to learn more about that, we can help you. If you want to make a commitment to that master who is generous, who is wanting for us to grow up in the knowledge of him, I would urge you to look to his actions and not the actions of the people that claim to follow him. This morning we can help you with that commitment, whether it's the waters of baptism, of formalizing that commitment to him, of putting off the old person, or whether it's praying with you or studying. Please contact us. You can contact us at sitkachurch@gmail.com, or you can call us here at the building. It was good to have everybody here this morning. That's the lesson for this morning. Next week, we'll look at the last part of Matthew 25 there and the final judgment. There was just too much to fit it all into one lesson. It's good to have everybody this morning. We'll see you next week.